A barren wasteland, the ruined aftermath of a nuclear war, the collapse of civilization, a return to tribal, nomadic, even barbaric societies. For some, this breakdown is inevitable, but for others, it's something to be prevented at all costs. It might have a religious cause, it might be purely due to human folly, but no matter the source, the question arises, what comes next? What happens after the end of the world? This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 17, and in this episode we're beginning a new series surrounding the apocalypse. So buckle up for your brief history of the end of the world. First of all, as you could tell from our intro there, Lisa is not able to make our recording today, so it's just Mel and myself. But like I said, we are starting our new topic on the apocalypse, and I am excited. This is a very fun topic, I think, and I know Lisa is sad that she's not able to make it because she was excited too. Mel, are you excited?
Oh, I'm always excited about the apocalypse. Always.
Can't come soon enough, right?
We might already be in it. I don't know.
That's a fair point. So, like I said in the kind of lead-in for this, we're kind of calling this episode the brief history of the end of the world because we thought that for this first episode on the topic about the apocalypse that we'd kind of do a run-up and just kind of talk about various things that people have thought about the end of the world throughout human history that we know of. Although before we do that, I did kind of want to make one kind of distinction about this is, I mean, when we're saying apocalypse, that does mean like the end of the world. And so I think if you're thinking of like apocalyptic movies, sometimes that gets crossed over with the term dystopia, which if you're familiar with the term dystopia, that's usually it's a society, it's the opposite of a utopia. It's not perfect. It's not pleasant. There's something wrong and flawed and usually oppressive with it. Think of the Hunger Games. That is probably a post-apocalyptic setting because it's got something has happened where the civilization that we have now is not there. It's not recognizable. But Hunger Games is probably more a dystopian story than apocalyptic because it's not focusing on like what happened. It's more on this, corrupt, oppressive society that Katniss and everybody else lives in. That sound about right, Mel?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think there are some books or movies I can think of where you actually see the apocalypse happen and then they follow the people into the post-apocalyptic time. But yeah, I think the Hunger Games, I'm not super familiar with the Hunger Games, but from what I know, I think it would be one of those more dystopian, the world's ended and now we're, following the survivors kind of idea.
Right. And it's not to say that it has to be one or the other. It's usually both. Like if you've seen the latest or any Mad Max movie, I mean, those are both post-apocalyptic and dystopian. So it's not like it's either or, but I mean, I think it's an important distinction to sort of make about these things because the apocalypse is not always the same thing as the dystopian. I mean, they occur together a lot of the times. Like I said, Mad Max, The Hunger Games, Postman, if you've seen that Kevin Costner movie, The Road. Yeah, I mean, all of these things are kind of both, but dystopian is not the same thing as post-apocalyptic. So, yeah, it's just something important, I think, to talk about.
Oh, yeah, and I think you also have books like Handmaid's Tale. That's not like the world ended. It's more like there's a dystopian society that begins.
Oh, that's a great example. Exactly. Like there hasn't been some sort of nuclear annihilation. It's just our civilization that has morphed in the future. If anybody's read Cloud Atlas, there's a future in that book that is dystopian. And then there's another future further in the future that's, I would say, post-apocalyptic. But yeah, no, Handmaid's Tale is an excellent example of the future that has like an evolution of our society, but society has never stopped. There hasn't been some sort of mass extinction. And I think that's the big thing to talk about with like the big difference between dystopian and apocalyptic is if they're not the same, it usually involves like a massive death of people. You know, most of humanity's population wiped out in something, nuclear war, plague, whatever.
Yeah, Matt. And one thing I was thinking about with apocalypse per se, kind of getting away from the dystopian fiction, is that apocalypse fiction seems to me to, while it started in very biblical or spiritual or faith-based religious aspects of the end of the world and what comes after, I'm thinking of Revelations, for example, apocalypse fiction seems to change over time, depending upon what we're scared of at the time, our societal fears, basically. So you move from, the earlier kind of religious or spiritual tales, people are doing something bad, the gods get angry, destroy the world to start again. Then it seems to become various other things. Maybe it's an environmental cause. There's some apocalypse fiction where the earth itself gets mad at us because we poisoned it and just starts killing off people. You also have periods of time where invasion, like alien invasion, coming in, destroying our society and taking over is an issue, and we're afraid of maybe invasions of others. And then, of course, there's the ever-present throughout probably all of apocalypse fiction, the idea of a plague, where everybody starts getting sick, or there's a pandemic, or our technology revolts against us and destroys everything. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of societal commentary in these stories, and they can be fantasy stories, they could be science fiction. You just have to have that idea of society's destruction at the center.
Right. And I like this idea. Let's kind of backtrack and kind of unpack these just a little bit before we dive into like the historical stuff. There, like you said, there's the religious side. We've angered the gods, like you said, Revelations, or even the early Greeks. That's who gave us the word apocalypse. It's a Greek word. So there's that idea that being cursed by God or gods, depending on your faith. Or I'm even thinking when you were talking about the environmental one, I was thinking about that really bad M. Night Shyamalan movie, The Happening. And did you ever see that one?
I didn't see it, but I have a basic idea of the premise.
Yeah. Oh, it was bad. It was so bad. But I liked the idea because a lot of the times you when we're talking about the apocalypse because of the Earth, it's not the Earth choosing to kill us. It's we've polluted the Earth so badly that we end up killing ourselves because of it. And obviously that's rooted in a fear of, global warming and the pollution that we're pumping into our environment, all the plastic that doesn't break down, the toxins from smokestacks burning and pollutants from factories and all that stuff being dumped in waters, and all of that eventually, down the road killing us and causing a mass human extinction. But yeah, the idea of The Happening was that it was actually the Earth itself, like the plants were putting out some sort of pheromone that was causing humans to kill each other. And that was like that spinning it on its head. I just wish that it had been a better movie because it was such a cool idea, but Mark Wahlberg was not a great actor for the role, and the script was just lacking, unfortunately.
That's too bad. It's kind of similar to an early sci-fi book, M.P. Shields' The Purple Cloud, which I think came out in the early 1900s, like 1900, 1901, where, if I remember correctly, the purple cloud is this poisonous vapor that basically we've been treating the Earth pretty poorly. We don't respect nature. So this purple cloud just like comes out of nowhere and starts roving around, killing people, almost like the Earth is causing an extinction for its own health, if that makes sense, like culling people in a way. And so the guy that's left, because he was in Antarctica, has to basically try to figure out, is the Earth intelligent? Is it after me? Like, what the heck is going on here? But yeah, this idea of like Earth taking vengeance, on us for our ignorance about it or our lack of taking care of it properly.
Right. Well, and kind of tied in with that is that idea of plague killing everyone, which we think nowadays about modern plagues like Ebola, if you ever saw the Dustin Hoffman movie Outbreak.
Yeah, which was based on Hot Zone, the book.
Right.
Which is terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I mean, there's a real reason why people were terrified when those first cases of Ebola were found in the U.S. a couple years ago. Because, I mean, it does not mess around. It's a scary, scary, scary disease. But, I mean, I think those ideas go back even to the Middle Ages when you had the Black Plague. I think there were a lot of people that, especially of the lower classes, that thought this was God's vengeance. This was the end of the world as foretold in Revelations and all of that, because, I mean, bubonic plague is also a disease that does not mess around. It's pretty disgusting and brutal. So, these different sort of topics that we pinpointed as different things that happen with the apocalypse, they can totally overlap with one another. You can have a plague that's caused by God, or a plague that's caused by the earth, or that idea that pollution creates some sort of virus thing. And so, it all kind of overlaps in that sense. The one that doesn't, I think, would be technology, robots specifically, like the Terminator, the future in the Terminator movies, and alien invasion. But those would almost be like, I guess we could call them external to Earth, because the technology, robots, self-aware AI that wants to kill humanity, that's human-made. It's not in any way naturally occurring. And same with aliens, I guess.
The aliens coming from outside definitely seems external, and I think that has to do... Yeah, there was a lot of alien invasion movies, during the Cold War. And so I think we have these kind of ideas about armed forces coming in and like taking over and ruining our society. The technology thing, when you were talking, I thought was really interesting. It's like we created the internet, or we created a robot, and it's almost Dr. Frankenstein like the creation goes too far, or the creation takes over. And I don't know, maybe that has to do with like our hubris, perhaps, or our thinking that we can use technology to make things better as progress, but it ends up having this kind of horrific underbelly, or this thing happens that we didn't intend. You know what I mean? It's external, but we also created it.
Well, I mean external in the sense of it's not like occurring in nature, I suppose, is what I meant by that. But absolutely, I think that idea of hubris, of us creating something that we shouldn't create, that old joke about justifying why the humanities exists in academia, that science can create bring dinosaurs back to life, but the humanities will be the ones to tell you why that's a bad idea. So... But I think there's a kernel of truth in that, and in particular that idea of hubris, of creating something that we don't know the full ramifications of until it's too late. Like, we couldn't have really predicted where we would be now 10 years ago when Apple unveiled the first iPhone. We knew that was a big deal. It was kind of a game changer technology-wise, but 10 years ago I would not have predicted the dependence that we have on smartphones in a way that we didn't 10 years ago. And so I think there's a lot of that kind of fear of these unintended consequences that get out of control and get out of hand. And, just over the last few years, they've done those studies that say that the blue light coming out of the displays can affect people's sleep, and it's why people have trouble sleeping if they're playing with their smartphone in the dark in bed, unless you use a blue light filter to make things a little more reddish in hue. Who could have known? Nobody knew at the time that would be an issue. And if you extrapolate that further, well, eventually we've got robots killing us all, right? And coming back in time to murder the future leader of humanity.
Well, and you also have us less dependent on ourselves, too. I mean, that's a big thing in apocalypse fiction, right? Because the survivors are the ones who knew something could happen and didn't become dependent on all the technology and didn't become dependent on society.
Right. And that's always something that over-dependence is something you see all the time, that relearning how to live closer to nature, as it were, fishing, hunting, knowing which fruits and berries won't kill you and all that kind of stuff. Very important in a post-apocalyptic future. So if you believe that this is going to happen, go ahead and get your survival handbook out now and start training, because you're going to need it. Apparently it takes a while. It's not an overnight process. But I mean, as much as I joke, I think you're right, though. It's that idea of no longer letting the technology run us. And when you stop and think about it, just think about how reliant we are on even basic technology. Like, we're sitting here recording this podcast on a computer using Skype to talk to each other because we're not in the same city. But then, you know, if you buy a brand new car off the lot today, it's got all kinds of computers and stuff in there that weren't in there even 10 or 15 years ago. Like the onboard computers. I'm not even talking about like the Bluetooth stereo, but just inside the engine monitoring things and whatnot. And, you know, if all that were to stop functioning, it's like, well, heck, I wouldn't know how to fix that. And I'm kind of handy with a car. I mean, I'm not a mechanic by any stretch, but I could do some basic stuff. But the onboard computer goes out, I have nothing. I got, you know, like,
right.
I mean, how many people do you know who don't even, like your parents who don't ever run a virus scan on their computer and click on every link that pops up, or, you know, all those sorts of things. It's like we are very dependent on our technology. So I think there's a real fear that if this failed, not even if it rose against us, but if just the technology were to be taken away, like, we'd be fairly helpless for a while, for sure.
Oh, yeah. I mean, think how much our financial situations are wrapped up in technology now. I mean, everybody's using a credit card. You know, everybody has online banking accounts, which makes it, you know, easier for your identity to be stolen. And if anything happened to the internet, where would you be at that point?
There was actually a show, not to like jump ahead too much, but that I only watched part of the first season because it just was at a bad time, but I was intrigued by it. It was a J.J. Abrams produced show called Revolution, and the whole premise was that one day anything electronic just stopped working. And it was one of those, you just have to buy the premise, because they didn't explain, or at least as far as I watched, they may have later, but they never explained the cause for it. It just, you have to accept that this is. And like 20 years later, how are people living? I mean, they're living in these agrarian societies that are farming and doing all of these sorts of things because there's no technology. You know, they can build a plow, but a radio isn't going to work anymore. No TVs, no anything like that. So yeah, it's, you know, we're pretty darn dependent on the technology we have.
Yeah, now I'm pretty terrified.
I mean, think about the last time your power went out, you know? And especially if it goes out at night. The last time our power went out, we had a storm blow through a couple of weeks ago, and it was like 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. And like, we didn't really know what to do because we had no power. We couldn't see. We had candles lit so we could see, but it's like, well, I don't even know what to do. You know? So
I'd probably just read a book.
Right, but
go to sleep.
Exactly. So, well, do you want to go ahead and jump into some of these like this true history of the apocalypse that we've been promising now?
Sure. Let's go for it.
Well,
where do you want to start?
Well, I would say chronologically, but no, let's not do that. How about probably the most famous one is, well, probably there's two that are the most famous, but most recently, the Mayans, and that idea of 2012 being a year that would be the end of the world. If you're listening to this now, obviously that wasn't the case. It's 2017, 5 years after the Mayans predicted that the end of the world would happen, and the world didn't end. But there are other scholars who said that it never meant the end of the world. It meant more of, a changing of a cycle or the beginning of a new phase or something like that. Does that sound right, Mel?
Yeah, it was, after the 13th section or ever turned over, it was just going to like go back to the beginning, basically. So not necessarily like the destruction of the world, more cyclical.
Right. But we are talking about an ancient culture that was extremely advanced in terms of mathematics and astronomy and even their calendar, which is where we got the idea of 2012 being the end of the world from in the first place. And so, you know, they make a very interesting case here because they were so technologically advanced for the time period.
Oh, yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, maybe we just got the time wrong, and it's actually, like, going to be 2018 or something. Isn't that what you do with apocalypse, is if you miss the date, you just readjust? And
with modern apocalyptic cults, that does seem to be the case. The world's going to end tomorrow. Tomorrow happens. Okay, the world's going to end a week from now. You just keep pushing it back. I was wrong. I had a new revelation. It says it's going to be 2018. So.
I remember listening to an interview, maybe I was on NPR in 2012 when the world was about to end, and this journalist was interviewing descendants of Mayans in Mexico, I believe it was. And they basically had nothing to say about the end of the world. They were much more interested in improving their current social issues and their current lives. They were much more contemporary focused than thinking about this kind of apocalyptic vision. I thought that was interesting.
Well, given what I know about Mayans and the Mayan people who are descended from Mayans and the way they're currently treated, I can understand them wanting to be more focused on their current socioeconomic issues. They're not treated too well by the Mexican government, as I understand it. So, Mayans, I mean, that's an early ancient mythology that, at least in some interpretations, talks about this idea of an end of the world. We've also mentioned offhandedly the Greeks kind of had this idea of the end of the world, and that's what gave us the word apocalypse. I think what's interesting about the Greeks is, yes, they believed in an end of the world, but they believed that there were constantly new world, like the world was constantly being recreated and destroyed. It wasn't quite a cycle, but that the gods were basically, first you had the Titans, and then Zeus kills the Titans, and so, I mean, there's this constant succession of planes of existence, I guess. And so, yes, they believed in an apocalypse, and yes, it might very well be the end of humanity, but it wasn't a necessarily terrifying thing for them. They weren't preoccupied with it and like fretting over it constantly.
Or even like a turnover in societies. I guess you could look at that as an apocalypse too. I mean, it depends on your perspective.
Oh, absolutely. And if we're talking ancient times, I mean, your society is the only exposure you really have. I mean, there was no such thing as global society like we have now. So the destruction of your town could very well, in some ways, be an apocalypse for you, I suppose. Maybe not. That might be incorrect.
Personal apocalypse versus global apocalypse.
Yes. I have a personal apocalypse daily when I look at my bank account. It's a financial apocalypse.
Yeah, my life is a lot of little personal apocalypses joined together, I think.
Another apocalypse that we've talked about kind of already and mentioned in passing, but we should definitely talk about, is the biblical apocalypse. The book of Revelations is one. Now, I know, as far as I'm to understand, the Jewish faith doesn't have an idea of apocalypse per se. They're still believe that there's a Messiah that's going to come. It was not Jesus. And so they don't have an apocalypse mythology, but Christians do, with especially the book of Revelations. And, there's all kinds of stuff described there. The four horsemen and of the apocalypse and all that sort of stuff.
You run into the problem of looking at it as symbols for things versus people trying to actually trace it out in history. For example, people have often looked at who could be the Antichrist figure, when the actual plagues, etc., will start, that sort of thing. So it seems like Book of Revelations is probably much more of that, as I was kind of joking earlier, of this kind of people predicting through the course of history when the end of the world will happen. Even though in the Bible, Jesus said pretty clearly, no one knows the end, when the end will come. If they think they know, they're wrong. So I don't know why people still point out particular times, and they're always wrong. But I think the book of Revelations is interesting because it's kind of like, you got allegory and symbol, and there is a message to it. But it seems like every time someone tries to read it into actual history, it doesn't quite pan out.
Well, Mel, I will put in one little correction there. You said that these people are using Revelations to predict the apocalypse are always wrong so far. And I would say so far is the key there. That, okay. I mean, you only have to be right in predicting the apocalypse once.
That is true. And there's really no one left afterward to argue with you about whether you're right or not.
Exactly. So you only got to hit that bullseye once, and then you're set.
One of the things that I find kind of interesting about the book of Revelations, Apocalypse in particular, and probably in other religious views as well, is the idea of the world ending, but it not being such a bad thing, I guess is the way I'll put it. Now when we think of zombie apocalypses or monsters or aliens coming apocalypses or robots killing everybody, it's pretty bleak and it's pretty horrible and it's not good for anybody who happens to survive. But if you think about these earlier apocalypse ideas, Mayans, it's a restarting, a cyclical thing. Book of Revelations, some people interpret that there will be a rapture where the chosen people who have been saved and because of their faith in Christ will be exempted from the horrible plagues and trials to come. So that would be something to look forward to if you're a believer. But then regardless of whether you interpret the Bible to have a rapture or not, after that apocalypse, you have the millennial reign of Christ. And so it's the destruction of the world, but there's a reward for the faithful. There's kind of a fixing of things, I guess you would say, afterward. So it's a destruction, but there's kind of a new beginning, as opposed to what we think of now, which are these very bleak apocalyptic scenes where there isn't that. It's, if anything, it's that the survivors are living really harsh and violent and brutal lives.
Right. And well, when you say this idea of the end of the world not being a bad thing per se, I also think about one of the things that we haven't touched on yet, which would be the Norse idea of Ragnarok, which I hope that's how you pronounce it. I can't really pronounce Norse words, especially ancient Norse mythological words. But I mean, the thing about Ragnarok is the thing about it is it's this series of events that kind of culminates in this great battle, and ultimately the result is the death of a large number of the major figures, like, the gods, Odin and Thor and all of them, and other natural disasters and things like that. But after all that happens, the world resurfaces, and it's new and fertile, and the surviving gods help to repopulate the earth. There are, I think, 2 human survivors who repopulate and all that. So, I mean, yes, it is this chaotic battle where there's lots of death and carnage, but ultimately, it's not the end. It's just, I guess, changing of the guard, if you will. So, yeah, not all of these end-of-the-world stories are necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, Matt, this idea of like a new beginning, it reminded me of flood stories from around the world, particularly if you're thinking of the Old Testament, Noah's story, where basically man has been pretty horrible, and God decides he wants to basically kind of wipe the slate clean and start over. But he decides that Noah and his family are good and need to be saved. And so you have Noah and his family taking a few of every animal on earth to keep them alive, surviving this massive flood that kills everybody, and then they kind of start over. It's like you wipe the slate clean and you start completely over, kind of like what you were describing with Ragnarok. And there is this kind of idea of a cleansing, with the flood, that you'll kind of sweep away what was there that didn't work out, or the people who are sinful or evil or whatever, and then just start over. Not quite like an Adam and Eve type idea, but yeah, I mean, you're repopulating the earth, basically.
Right. Well, I've always found the flood myths so interesting because they pop up in so many different cultures that all date to around the same time. And so I've always been interested in this idea because it seems like, well, we know that about this time period, there must have been some kind of flood in that area, because you've got the story of Noah from the Hebrew people at that time, but you've also got the Epic of Gilgamesh that includes a flood myth, and I believe there's several others. And so, yeah, I do like that idea of Noah, that repopulating the world, and the end of the world wasn't a bad thing, but like you said, lots of people died in the. It always makes me think too of. I mean, we've talked a little bit about this idea of cyclical time with talking about the Mayans, but one other culture that has a cyclical idea of time is the Hindu culture, the Hindu religion. And they really did believe that time is a circle, that not only do they believe in a circle of reincarnation, that you're born, you live, you die, and then you're reincarnated and start that process all over again, but that time itself was this constant revolving circle. So you've got the seasons going from spring all the way through winter and starting over again. But even more so, the universe begins and ends. And so they incorporated this idea in their gods, where they've got Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and everyone thinks of Shiva as Shiva is known as the destroyer, and so us in the West will think, oh, Shiva, it's evil, it's bad. But for the Hindus, Shiva is not a bad god. Shiva is just something like, you have to have destruction in order to have creation again, you know. So even in terms of their idea of the universe, at some point the earth will end, but it will begin again in some other form. And so that end of the world is not always bad. You know, we were talking about, too, in doing this history of the apocalypse, this isn't really a historical idea of the apocalypse, but I just wanted to bring up the book Leviathan by the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. He's probably most famously known for this phrase where he says that before civilization, life was nasty, brutish, and short. And I think what he's really getting at with that idea is that idea of the social contract. You know, this idea that you shouldn't kill me because it harms humanity as a whole, especially when you're talking about it, you know, smaller societies. It is a really harmful thing. And so we come up with this social contract. You don't steal from me, I don't steal from you. Let's, you know, come up with basic rules on how to act with each other. And I think part of that fear that we have of living in this post-apocalyptic world is that breakdown of civilization and this return to that pre-social contract idea that Thomas Hobbes was talking about. I mean, if you think about that movie or the book The Road or the Mad Max movies or The Postman or any of these things where society has collapsed, The Walking Dead, I think would be a good example. Some of the people that they run across are very much like this. I'm stronger than you, so I'm going to take what I want, versus how we live now, where that's really generally, at least mostly, frowned upon. So, you know, I think it would not be, I think we would be remiss for not bringing up this idea in Leviathan.
Oh, no. And, you know, I was thinking while you were talking, it's almost like it's almost like our society, the way it's set up, and the social compacts that we make with one another are inoculations against apocalypse. Because, you know, when we talked about the zombie movies and apocalypse during our zombie series, which if you haven't listened to our zombie series, please go back and do. I think we came back to a couple times this idea of zombie attacks, break down life, break down society, break down all those things that we think protect us and give us some sort of measure of control of our lives. I think it's kind of interesting if you reverse that. If you're thinking about what Thomas Hobbes is saying, it's like you create a social contract in order to protect yourself from the destruction of life in the world. You know what I mean? It's almost like the social contract becomes a safety net of some sort. We've seen chaos and disorder. Let's fix it. Unfortunately, if that breaks down, you're just going to go back to chaos and disorder.
Well, exactly. And I think that's what a lot of these post-apocalyptic stories that have been coming out over the last 50 or 100 years in particular are really concerned with, in a lot of ways, is that idea about how, at least in those authors' minds, how thin that social contract can be, that it doesn't take much to tip us back into this idea of barbarism and, you know, might makes right and all of that. But I do like that idea that this could be an inoculation against the apocalypse, that hopefully if we've built if we've created the social compact correctly, then our civilization should prevail even in the face of something like a nuclear war or something. One would hope. I'm not that optimistic. I'm firmly in the camp that if I'm surviving a nuclear war, it's going to be like some Mad Max kind of crap. Like,
yeah, I kind of hope I go out in the initial attack. It's like I don't want to see what happens.
Well, I mean, you just look at how easy it is to start a riot in the right situations. You know, it's scary just how easy it is for people to lose control like that. But
sadly, I think all you would need is like an electromagnetic pulse to take out our technology, and it wouldn't take long before things just started to fall apart.
Although I will be honest, do you remember that blackout that happened in New York in the early 2000s that lasted for a couple of days, like all of New York City.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, like, I know during the time when the Son of Sam killer was happening in the 70s, and this is, portrayed in the movie Son of Sam, there was actually a huge heat wave throughout the city, and so crime rates actually spiked during that summer, which is why in that Summer of Sam movie they kind of play around that idea. So I found it fascinating that, heat waves were causing spikes in violent crime, but when all of New York City and upper New York, I believe, lost power it was 2 or 3 days, I believe, it was relatively calm. I mean, people were walking across the bridges out of the city to try to get to a place where there was power. But aside from that, I mean, there wasn't massive rioting. I find that interesting, that maybe something changed in the 20, 30 years between the 70s and the early 2000s, where maybe it was something socially, or maybe it was just that the conditions were different. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist or anything, but it does give me a little bit of hope that if things were to fail, that perhaps humanity would not completely go back to some sort of barbaric attacking each other and whatnot. But
that is true. I'd forgotten about that. Though I think if you have the hope or the concrete thought that something's going to be temporary, it would be different than if mysteriously regions of the country didn't have access to power.
Really, I mean, we keep talking, I think we're skirting around the issue because we don't want to step on the toes of future episodes too much, but I think the thing that's really important when talking about apocalyptic fiction, and by apocalyptic fiction, I mean movies as well, movies, comics, novels, everything. It's kind of a lump term there. The biggest time for it has been in the last 100 or so years. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and being very broad, because we're not in a specific themed episode right now. Yeah, Matt, I think saying that this kind of literature has been really prevalent in the last 150 so years would be right. And this isn't an exhaustive list or anything, but just when we were chatting about this episode, a couple of the titles that came to our minds from the 1800s in particular was Mary Shelley's The Last Man, for instance, which came out in 1826. And of course, Mary Shelley is famous for writing Frankenstein, one of the first, if not the first, science fiction novels. And The Last Man is kind of interesting because, well, one, I think it's interesting because it's set in the 21st century. So I'm just thinking about, how, let's see, she's writing about the 2080s and the 2090s, so we haven't quite made it there yet. But her view of the future for an 1800s view is kind of interesting. She has the apocalypse happen because of a plague. And there's also, if I remember correctly, the idea of someone who is an individual who's immune to it for some reason. So she does entertain the idea of immunity, which I thought was interesting for the 1800s. And one other thing that she has is it becomes global. She's focusing on Constantinople is in there. Greece, there's a war going on in Greece. The characters themselves are from England. England is one of the last holdouts against the plague. And so what happens toward the end of the second volume is that survivors from all across the world, including America, start coming to England. And in fact, the American survivors start lawlessly plundering everything when they get there, and they have to make a truce with them before they decide where to move on. And so I just thought it was interesting in the 1800s that she not only would examine the medical idea of a spreading plague and possible immunity leading to maybe a survivor and a beginning again of humanity, but also the global nature. It's not just people in England. It's not even just people in Europe. It's people from across the world, like trying to get to these last places where the plague hasn't gotten to yet. And you kind of have a similar idea, but on a much smaller scale, in Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death from the 1840s. You have a group of well-to-do partiers having a mask, a costume ball at the moment when they know that there's a plague going on outside that's killing everybody, and they're kind of just partying until they die. And then the Red Death actually enters into the room in that horrifying moment. It's almost, you mentioned Ebola earlier, Matt. It's kind of got that feel. And then you got to mention Jack London's The Scarlet Plague, which was a serial in 1912 and in book form in 1915, which was partially inspired by Poe's Mask of the Red Death. So the Scarlet Plague basically starts spreading throughout the country and the world. And what happens is I think people turn red when they get the illness and they die. And so you have people all across the country turning scarlet and dying. And people have to leave and migrate. And the main character is an English professor, actually, who I think it's like the plague takes place in 2013. And he's crossing America with his grandchildren in 2073, trying to explain to them what the world was like before everybody died of the plague. And so just those three, that kind of early to mid 1800s into the turn of the century, they all three have very similar ideas to some of the contagion and plague-inspired apocalypse movies and fiction I think we're seeing right now in 2017.
Absolutely. And I mean, well, I say that. I haven't read any of those except The Mask of the Red Death, but I mean, I think you're right to say that if the 1900s was really this huge, like, I wouldn't say resurgence, but there was so much apocalyptic fiction that happened and really starting after World War II. But it does go back further and not just talking about cultural myths or religious beliefs, but actual fiction going back into the 1800s at least.
I'm teaching modernism right now, and we were talking about T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men today, which I love that poem. But
I love The Hollow Men.
I just, such a great poem. And I was thinking to myself about the apocalyptic feeling of that time period, you know, like World War I happens, what is it? First day of the Battle of Somme, one day, 20,000 British soldiers die, one day, and that's just the British side. And then that's like this horrible, internecine, terrible, horrific war. And then right after the war, you've got the Spanish influenza that crosses the globe and kills, you know, I mean, I don't know numbers off the top of my head, but probably close to as many people as the war even. A whole generation almost wiped out by war, and then younger people, of course, are the ones getting Spanish influenza. You can totally understand how this apocalyptic poem, The Hollow Men, would be written. Obviously, people use it now as a post-World War II atomic age idea, the bang and the whimper idea, but that post-World War I era was so dark. I could totally see how people thought that that was the end.
Absolutely. And, you know, I always think about that. Like, if you read anything from just around that time period, like you said, the modernist, especially the early modernist time, okay, no, early modern would be like Shakespeare's time period. But, you know, those early modernist works, like T.S. Eliot or Gertrude Stein or anything like that, like Gertrude Stein and Dada, just nothing makes sense anymore. So let's write essentially nonsense, you know, because everything we thought we knew is just nonsensical because of World War I and what happened with the carnage and the horror and everything else. I mean, it was completely unimaginable. I'm so glad you brought up The Hollow Men, because I hadn't even thought of that poem, and it's been so long since I've read it, but I love it. I just love the poem in general. It's a very powerful one.
Yeah, particularly the fifth stanza where he has the children's song that's basically describing, you know, the end of the world. It's just so powerful to me.
You know, I mean, definitely we see these apocalyptic stories coming in response to things that are happening culturally or historically even. And so it makes sense that after something as unprecedented and unprecedentedly horrific as World War I, that you'd have something like The Hollow Men, and just like the Cold War and those fears that are permeating our culture, you'd see so much apocalyptic stories and movies and everything else coming out in the 1950s and onward. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? So, well, in all honesty, I mean, I know this has felt like a bit of a whirlwind tour through the apocalypse, but this is probably a good place for us to cut off our history of the apocalypse. Haven't gotten up to the present day, but that's actually going to be coming later on in our series. We're definitely going to be exploring this Cold War and nuclear fears that happened in a lot more detail in a later episode. So just be on the lookout for our next episode in 2 weeks, and thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy the apocalypse.
This is the No Fear Podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fear Cast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Or you can support us on Patreon. Supporters get special perks, such as early access to our main episodes and exclusive mini-episodes, released in the weeks in between our normal schedule, depending on the tier you choose. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.